Office of the President of the United States, 1951. Mr. President, the world finds itself in the crossroads of history, and you, sir, are in the driver's seat. Assembled in the Oval Office were President Truman, select members of his cabinet, and a handful of trusted advisors. Previously, some aide had hung a large map on a free wall, the same place Roosevelt had once been shown similar maps displaying the positions of the American and Allied forces during the Second World War just 6 years prior. Now the map showed the Middle East, with the all-too-familiar iron crosses of the Third Reich dotting territories formerly held by the European colonial powers as far south as Transjordan and Palestine. Each cross represented an entire division of soldiers. By Truman's quick count of the crosses, the Nazis had amassed over 100,000 in the occupied territories. Mr. President, are you listening? The speaker who interrupted his train of thought once more was his Secretary of Defense, John C. Marshall. The man had aged visibly in the post-war years, the strain of European defeat evident on the lines and creases of his face. It weighed him down considerably, and more than once Truman had considered ordering the soldier into an early retirement for his and the nation's own good. Lay the options on the table once more. I want everyone clear on our paths forward. Marshall nodded at the president's command and turned to the map. Seated next to him on one of the couches, hastily pulled into the office for this secret meeting, was the Chief of Staff of the Army, a heavy-set man who, even in his senior years, was still more muscle than fat. He wore a dour look on his face, clearly displeased with the direction of the conversation. Marshall cleared his throat before gesturing at the map. Mr. President, the Third Reich's greatest weakness for the moment is its access to oil deposits. The North Caucasus oil fields are at maximum production, and they are enough to feed the Reich's demands for now. There are exploratory wells being dug in the Volgograd and Saratov, but pre-war Soviet estimates indicated only a few million tons of oil in the region. The Nazis have been far less successful establishing operational fields in Tatarstan and further toward West Siberia. Soviet insurgents have made life hell for them, and their colonization of the former Soviet Union has yet to reach further than 100 miles east of Moscow. Understandably, there's not many German citizens willing to move that far into very hostile territory, and I'm not just talking about the weather. There's also the matter of depopulation efforts by the Reich. At this, every man in the room visibly grimaced. Despite the numerous differences among the military leaders and politicians present, all were disgusted by the reports coming out of what the Nazis had publicly called its Cultural Protection Program. They were slave camps, and some worse. If President Truman hadn't seen the reports himself, he never would have believed the staggering scale of the killing, tens of millions since the end of the war. It appears that Herr Hitler had not considered the effect depopulation of the occupied territories would have on the economy. There are reports he's begun to listen to some of his advisors, and the depopulation has shifted considerably from extermination to forced labor. But the Reich still in a lurch. Its army captured a whole lot of territory that its security forces then swiftly vacated of most people living there. They're not just lacking in manpower, but skilled labor to dig wells, extract the oil, and so on. The head of the CIA cleared his throat to interrupt. Mr. President, with your permission, I believe there's ways we could significantly disrupt Nazi efforts in the occupied Soviet territories and beyond. Truman's chief spy smiled a cold, empty smile that sent shivers down the spines of most of the men in the room. The Soviets in their Far East territories haven't given up the fight, even without our help. Old Stalin is still sending hundreds of guerrillas west every month. I believe we can greatly accelerate the effort with proper financing. The Kuomintang Chinese army still has large stocks of former Soviet equipment that we could purchase and send over through the Chinese-Soviet border to avoid suspicion from the Nazis. Truman nodded his approval. The Soviet front had been the last of the war, despite constant warnings. Joseph Stalin had never dreamt that Hitler would truly turn on him after conquering Britain and cementing his grip on Europe. The fool hadn't realized that he'd chummed the waters himself with his botched invasion of Finland, proving the Soviet army was incompetent and poorly led. He had to give it to the Soviets, though. They fought tooth and nail for every inch of ground they inevitably lost, causing millions of casualties for the Germans. It had been enough for the US to kick Germany out of North Africa, but an invasion across the Mediterranean to liberate Europe would have still been impossible. Now the Soviets were holed up on the other side of the Urals, a vast frozen wilderness of mostly nothing. Even with US aid, millions of Soviet refugees had simply starved to death. If the Germans didn't eventually cross the mountains to finish them off, the Soviet Union would likely fall apart soon from a simple lack of Soviets. But they still had enough manpower to send constant guerrilla raids across the mountains to harass the Germans. Stalin was a vengeful, bitter bastard. Let's do it. but make sure not a single gun, grenade, even bullet sent is American. We can't afford the confrontation, especially if…" Truman nodded at Marshall to continue once more. Yes, Mr. President, so as I was saying, the Reich's oil problems are forcing them south. They've seized many of the northern Middle Eastern territories administered by the former European powers, but the region is still relatively oil poor. The true prize is south." Marshall motioned at the southern part of the Middle Eastern map, specifically Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia holds much of the most easily accessible oil fields in the region, perhaps even the planet. Some of these fields are administered by American companies, though the Saudis took over production of most of the fields after the collapse of Britain and France. The nation is rich, Mr. President, but militarily weak. Even with years of military aid, the Nazis could take the nation in a week or two at the most, given the current state of their armed forces. The Chief of Staff of the Army spoke up. "Mr. President, we cannot allow the Nazis to take those oil fields. If Saudi falls, so will Iran and the rest of the Middle East. Then we're left with the Nazis holding the tap on the greatest supply of oil on the entire planet. We must prevent this at any cost, Mr. President." Truman knew the cost that the senior Army officer was referring to. The man had been a proponent of using nuclear weapons preemptively since the Middle East crisis began with German troop movements a week ago. The Secretary of the Navy shook his head. "The last thing we want is a third world war, especially so soon after the second." The Army chief turned red in the face. "We got 24 battle force carriers on the Nazis' 8. Even with them finishing a new one every 16 months, they can't cross the Atlantic. And they damn well know it. We don't need to take Europe. We just need to throw them out of the Middle East. And we need to do it now, while we've still got the nuclear advantage." Truman didn't interrupt the brewing argument just yet. He wanted to hear what the secretary would say. He knew the US retained the nuclear advantage. The Nazis had been slow on developing the bomb during the war. Hitler breaking up research efforts across multiple laboratories in his paranoia didn't help. When the US dropped the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it had been a wake-up call to the Reich, and the German nuclear program had progressed at breakneck speed. They conducted their first test in 1948, but the US had hundreds of bombs by now, and making 100 more a year. His intelligence chiefs told him that the Germans still only had about 100 or so themselves. "They may have fewer bombs, but they got far better rockets than we do. And it would only take a dozen nuclear-tipped rockets to bring this country to its knees. New York, Washington, Chicago, Boston, hell, maybe even as far south as Atlanta or Miami. The rockets get better every year." The Navy Secretary was right. The Nazi rocket program under the direction of Werner von Braun had left the US hopelessly behind. They'd even put up a satellite the year prior. It wouldn't take much to put a bomb up there and drop it right on their heads. "With our carriers, we could punch open holes in South Europe through the Mediterranean for our bombers. Hell, you should know that, they're your ships." "Gentlemen, enough." Truman finally asserted his authority. Taking a moment to allow everyone to compose themselves, he continued. "I have no wish to be the president who saw one world war through to its end only to immediately launch a third. Nor do I wish to preside over a nation with a dozen or more American cities suffering the same fate as Nagasaki or Hiroshima. But I agree we must take action in the Middle East. General, would you please continue with our options?" Truman nodded at Marshall. He looked positively exhausted as he laid out America's options for averting a Nazi global takeover without launching a destructive nuclear war. "We have the conventional option. Even as we speak, on your orders, we've got the Vincent and other ships steaming for the region with enough nuclear munitions for a localized campaign. However, the alternative, and the one I and the Secretary both agree with—" "I as well, Mr. President." The CIA chief nodded in agreement. "The alternative most of us are in agreement with is a simple show of force. Show the Nazis we mean business, drop a nuke close enough to their forwardmost forces in Palestine that it singes their eyebrows. Let them know that we can and we will use nuclear weapons if they encroach on Saudi territory." Truman nodded. As far as the end of the world ideas went, this one seemed the sanest. And the Saudis? Can't help but think they wouldn't be too happy about a nuke going off on their soil. I believe they are in agreement. It's a price well worth paying. The room went quiet as Truman thought to himself. After a few moments, the Army chief broke the silence. "Mr. President, I don't believe a show of force is sufficient. We have the advantage, for now. Future generations of Americans will look back on this moment, which may well decide if they live free or in bondage to the Reich. Those future Americans have to actually be born to be able to look back on today." "I agree, General. Let's drop the nuke. Show them we mean business. How fast can we get a bomber out there?" Marshall nodded, relief on his face for the first time this entire meeting. "We can have a B-36 in the air within hours from our airbase in Morocco. They can use one of the pre-staged munitions we have on site. and drop their payload 16 hours from now, just as dusk is falling in the region. Perfect. This psychological effect will be greatly magnified in the dark. The CIA chief grinned again, sending another cold chill down the spines of everyone in the room. Make it so then. This meeting is adjourned. Gentlemen, thank you, and God help us that we made the right choice. 18 hours later, 42,000 feet above Tabuk Province, Saudi Arabia. Joe, we got a problem. Captain Joe Mencino had been expecting the call. The sky was as clear as one could ask for, but several thousand feet below, the desert had turned into a rolling, dark mess. Even at 42,000 feet, the big bomber still shuddered from the massive updrafts. Copy that, Matt. Go ahead. Early in the last war, Joe had done away with standard military protocol aboard his aircraft. Everyone who flew with him knew that as soon as the wheels were up, the standard protocol stopped being as important. They were on their own as far as Joe was concerned, and military protocol had a nasty habit of eating up precious life-saving seconds in situations where that sort of thing mattered. Halfway down the massive length of the big nuclear express B-36 Peacemaker, Mac, his bombardier since the second half of the European campaign, was trying in vain to spot the ground below through his bomber sight. So far, the aircraft had remained on course thanks to radio beacons some Army commandos had raced out in motorbikes to lay out, but the final approach was all up to the navigator and the bombardier. I can't see a damn thing. Locals call it a hubub or something like that, big sandstorm. But we got bigger problems than me not seeing anything. Joe and his co-pilot looked at each other worriedly. Both knew the gravity of the mission and had been fully briefed on the consequences of failure. Joe, we're taking real nasty winds down there, big updrafts. Even if they don't collapse the bomb chute on the way down, there is no telling how far off course they'll blow the damn thing. We're meant to give them Nazi boys a nice tan, not kill thousands of them. As if to punctuate the bombardier's words, the plane shuddered from another massive updraft. Joe moved the mic to a more comfortable position on his face before responding. Yeah, if the chute fails, how long do we have? Estimate. The bombardier was silent a moment. Joe, that's not… Estimate, please. I don't know, 30 seconds? The chutes on the big bomb were supposed to buy around 120 seconds for the bomber to wheel away and haul out of town before the blast. Despite her size, the B-36 was speedy. They might be able to do it in 90. Hell, they might even survive at 60. Joe, I'm telling you, the real problem is I can't even see where to drop or guess where it'll land. It was crucial that they drop the bomb close enough to the nearest Nazi positions that they see and even feel the full effect of the nuclear blast. Otherwise, the show of force simply wouldn't have the teeth it needed to hopefully deter an even more catastrophic conflict. On the other hand, they weren't meant to actually start the Third World War either. We need to abort. His co-pilot instinctively reached for the flight controls, but Joe reasserted his control. Negative. You know damn well what's on the line here. I didn't see one war through just to fight a second. If we get this wrong, it won't matter either way now, will it? Joe wasn't going to argue with his co-pilot. He keyed his mic into the command circuit available to only select members of the crew. Mac, I'm gonna need you to do your very best to put us right on track. We're dropping one way or the other. There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the radio. Sir, I can't even guess wind speeds down there. I don't want to be the guy that started World War III on a guess. Well, then you better make it a damn good guess. Okay. There was silence once more. His co-pilot wore an intense look of disapproval, but despite the relaxed protocols aboard the aircraft, he knew better than to question his captain. The only sound was the steady, dull roar of the 6 engines cutting through the desert winds. Finally, the command circuit crackled to life once more. Captain, make course 343. Hold her steady. Mac had reverted to military protocol. Last time he'd done that, a fighter had just killed half the crew in a single machine gun pass somewhere over southern Germany. Confirmed, you have release authority. The B-36 flew northwest for several more minutes. Finally, the big bomb bay shuttered open, and a single bomb dropped from the belly of the plane. Immediately, the big bomber banked hard to the right, taking advantage of prevailing winds to push it along. The parachute held, initially. Somewhere around the time the bomb penetrated the uppermost layers of a massive dust storm, it must have collapsed. 52 seconds after release, the big bomb exploded 2,000 feet above sea level, the massive shockwave catching up to the big bomber and shaking it until the crew thought that every bolt in the aircraft would come apart. But they didn't, and the B-36 shuddered her way back on course south for her friendly airfields. In its wake, the nuclear explosion was largely shrouded in the massive dust storm, but this had an unexpected effect, as the nuclear fire lit up the massive storm from within, creating an apocalyptic light show even more terrifying than President Truman could have hoped for. West Ural's Cultural Correction Camp No. 118, Reich-occupied territories. Twin smokestacks reached 24 meters into the sky. When they were in operation, the dense black clouds of sooty ash they spilled out contrasted with the stark white peaks of the Ural Mountains behind them. But those smokestacks weren't working now, and hadn't been for a while. Stefan pushed the thoughts of the smokestacks out of his mind. Today was a day of joy for Camp 118. The Nazis largely left the prisoners to their own devices, all of them a mixture of former Soviet citizens and other undesirables of one sort or another the Reich had no need of. There were homosexuals from within the Reich itself, Roma, communists, and even a small number of Jews in the camp. The latter were scarcer and scarcer. They had borne the brunt of the Nazis' extermination efforts during and immediately after the war, when Germany and America signed an armistice agreement after the fall of Europe. They had built a community of sorts for themselves within the razor wire confines of the camp, and as long as they showed up to roll call each evening and performed their assigned work assignments, the guards didn't bother them. Stefan had assumed the role of spiritual leader. Despite the mix of different faiths and cultures, he'd been nothing more than a common Christian man before being rounded up in the German victory over the Soviet Union. He wasn't a priest, nor had any special religious education, but he took to the job anyways, and he did his best to bring a little cheer to his adopted flock. Today was a day of cheer. Toba and his wife Polly, 2 Roman prisoners recently brought to the camp, had a son. The small baby was proof of miracles in Stefan's eyes. Poor, frail Polly had been forced to deliver with no medical attention or supplies, save what could be scrounged up from around the camp. The Nazis didn't actively discourage pregnancies. In fact, they found it best to meddle as little as possible with the prisoners. But the baby's food would come from the same unchanging food rations the Nazis brought in each week. Sadly, with so many dying from the atrocious labor conditions and the extreme weather, there was often at least a little surplus. Stefan knew nothing of Roma culture or what religious rituals they might prefer. His own tradition dictated the baby should be baptized, but he thought that was a choice best left to the parents. Instead, he celebrated with the mother and father, sharing their joy and stoking it like a small fire in a very long, very dark night. "God has brought us a miracle today," Toba smiled at him, proud father, as Polly swaddled the baby in discarded fabric to protect it from the bitter cold. "You think you would have learned, you fool." Stefan knew the source of the slightly slurred words, even before turning around to greet the one who spoke them. Nikita had been a soldier in the Red Army, a full-blooded communist through and through. He was, as he often was, drunk on cheap camp liquor. Some of the men brewed in not-so-secret batches. In exchange for a few bottles for the guards to share, they turned a blind eye to this as well. "You think you would have learned under the communists, but here you still are. Even before the Germans, didn't you learn anything from the purges?" Nikita was referring to the silent campaign the Soviet Union had waged against the Christians, Jews, and Muslims, whose places of worship had often been forcibly converted into museums of atheism under Stalin's reign. The worshippers were either shot or deported, often forced to labor camps not unlike this one. "Where was your God then? Where's your God now, you stupid fool?" Nikita spit out the insult, literally and figuratively. He is in the same place he was when his son hung on the cross, weeping at the evil of man and the price required to redeem him. Nikita blinked a few times in surprise. Clearly, this was not what he had been expecting. "So, you admit your God didn't even care to save his own son?" "Nikita, you can have perfect morality or free will, but not both." The old communist grew angry. How dare this religious idiot twist communist ideology about free will and self-determination around on him? "If your God is so good, then where is he now? Where was he in the war?" Stefan shook his head slightly, then turned to look at the newborn baby. "He is here, Nikita." He turned once more to the communist, placing a hand over his heart. "Always here." Nikita grew enraged, but whether it was the cheap booze or his anger at the religious fool's refusal to insult him back, he choked on a response. A loud whistle pierced the chilly air. The sun was starting to set, and daily counts never took place before full dark. In the distance, there was the sound of approaching trucks and the shouting of guards. A cold chill ran down the spine of everyone gathered, quickly sobering even Nikita. Trucks and an early count could mean only one thing. The camp rushed to a small parade field, where they quickly fell into neat formation for the daily count. But the prisoners were noticeably nervous as they beheld 3 trucks parked directly behind the camp commissar. Looming ominously in the distance, just a quarter-mile down the front gate in front of them, were the twin smokestacks, still visible in the slowly fading light. The commissar withdrew a clipboard from inside his jacket and quickly thumbed over the pages. Unadulterated terror seemed to sweep over the crowd, though nobody made so much as a sound. Polly clutched her baby tightly to her chest. sheltering it from both the Nazis and the bitter wind under layers of discarded cloth. But the Nazis didn't care, and in an almost bored tone the commissar addressed the crowd. Due to insurgent activity and pressing matters elsewhere, camp funds have been reduced significantly. This merits a similar reduction in personnel who will be relocated. When your name is called, step forward. The terror became thick enough that one might cut it with a knife. All knew what relocation meant. Maybe once the Nazis had been able to obfuscate their exterminations, but now, even in the most remote camps, everyone knew the truth. The commissar thumbed through his list of names, calling out individuals almost at random. More than once, guards had forcibly seized the individual called up, dragging them wailing to the trucks. The rest of the formation stood stock still in silence, hoping against hope their name wouldn't be the next to be called. WWII. From directly behind the couple, Stefan saw Polly shake, as if she'd been physically struck. He had the instinct to move to catch her should she fall, but found that his legs too had turned to ice. Next to her, Tova was similarly frozen, eyes staring straight ahead in dumbfounded horror. Nikita, the old communist just a few bodies left of Stefan, audibly gasped. Stefan expected perhaps the communist would sneer, shake his head in disgust. "Where is your god now?" "WWII!" the commissar shouted angrily. Toba looked down at the infant clutched against Polly's chest. He imagined seeing the child's face through the scraps of cloth, protecting him from the near-zero temperatures. He prayed internally for just one glimpse. Then he sucked in a breath of air and stepped forward. "Here!" The sound came from behind him, and Toba turned in surprise as Stefan broke formation and began to move down the line to the open lane at the formation's left. Stefan slowed, only briefly as he neared the communist, looking him in the eye as he passed. Nikita expected the religious man would sneer, maybe shake his head in disgust at his cowardice. But he didn't. Stefan simply nodded his head and continued on. "Are you WWII?" The commissar looked skeptically at Stefan as he ordered the guards preparing to take him to the truck to stop. "You don't look Roma to me." "I am WWII, Herr Kommissar." The German looked him over, down at the name on his list and then at the assembled crowd of prisoners. Then he simply shrugged his shoulders and made a check mark next to Toba's name. Didn't matter to him who went or not. All that mattered was the books remained balanced. Office of the President of the United States. A single knock on the door alerted President Truman to the knocker's identity even before he ushered the man in. The Secretary of Defense entered at the president's invitation, and Truman offered him a drink. Naturally, Marshall declined it. He couldn't remember if the man was a teetotaler or simply not fond of drinking, but he never accepted it. Was the operation a success? Marshall nodded, but not nearly as quickly as Truman would have liked. Something wasn't quite right. "I'm sure the State Department will be here shortly, no doubt with diplomatic protests from the Germans. But yes, Mr. President, our radio intercepts indicate the Nazis have called a halt to their advance, and there does not appear to be any signs of injury or death amongst their forces, despite the imprecision of the drop. I am told the flight crew did their best. I want them all put up for an award. Make the proper recommendations to the Pentagon." "Yes, Mr. President." Silence for a moment. "All right then, Marshall, out with it. What's the rest?" Marshall was silent for a moment, then sat down warily on one of the chairs in front of the president's desk. "Sir, we had an observation team on the ground, engineers and scientists, escorted by some Army commandos. Same boys that put out the radio beacons to guide the peacemaker in. The eggheads were looking to make observations on the real-world deployment of a nuclear weapon, something that, naturally, they normally wouldn't have the chance to do." Another long pause. "The bomb blew significantly off course, given the circumstances. They were killed, Mr. President." Now it was Truman's turn to sit, the drink he'd been sipping now forgotten in his hand. "I'm told the flight crew did their best, risked their own life." "Yes, Mr. President. My preliminary inquiry indicates this is correct. Conditions on the ground were bad, very bad, Mr. President. And the nature of those regional storms, they're impossible to Marshall, do you know what it's been like to carry the weight of being the man who ordered the atomic bomb dropped not once, but twice in the war? Do you know what they say about me even now? Can you imagine what future historians will say?" Marshall didn't respond. "Now, I've become the first president to not only drop the atomic bomb on an enemy, but to create the first American atomic casualties." There was a long silence in the Oval Office. In the world beyond the half-curved walls of the office of the President of the United States, the grinding gears of American and Nazi bureaucracy, two global superpowers, wore on, each seeking to grind the other down as a priority of national survival. One would hope that they would be merciful in their judgment, given the extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in. Mr. President, the Nazi threat is an existential one. not just to the nation, but to the world as we know it. I fear we have averted a third world war, but have entered into a new Cold War and simply punted the ball downfield for now. But that's exactly what you've done, Mr. President. You've bought us time. Now go check out I Survived 100 Days of Nuclear War, or click this other video instead.